He was born into gold, silk, and 1,000 years of power. A Habsburg prince, handsome, noble, destined for greatness. But Otto of Austria didn't rule. He spiraled through wine-soaked nights, brothels in Vienna, scandals whispered from Paris to Prague. In the end, he died alone, his body rotting from vice, his name erased by his own bloodline. This is not just a fall. It is a drowning, with no one reaching in. He was born into a world where names weighed more than deeds, where a single drop of blood could open palace doors or close them forever, where every cradle rocked beneath the shadow of empires. But for Archduke Otto of Austria, the grandeur of his lineage would become a noose sewn in gold thread, slowly tightening with each wasted breath. The year was 1865, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire still stood like a faded colossus over the heart of Europe. Its marble facades cracked but proud, its military parades still thunderous on cobbled avenues. And within its imperial veins pulsed the names of men bred for conquest, diplomacy, and continuity. Otto, grandson of Emperor Franz Joseph I, and brother to the future and final Emperor Karl I, was born into this fragile, flickering twilight, swaddled in velvet and baptized not just in holy water, but in centuries of suffocating expectation. They called him the Prince of Two Empires, not for any throne he sat upon, but because he carried within him the bloodlines of both Austria and Hungary, threads spun tightly together in dynastic matrimony, binding him to the fate of two peoples who would soon begin to tear each other apart. He was not merely a boy. He was a breathing symbol, a polished artifact of Habsburg continuity, a reminder that as long as children like Otto were born, the empire itself could never truly die. But history is rarely kind to its living relics, and Otto, for all his titles, godparents, and embroidered coats, would find himself trapped not in a gilded cage, but in a gilded script, one written long before his first breath. A role rehearsed by uncles, cousins, and grandfathers who had all learned the same lines. Duty before pleasure, silence before rebellion, dynasty before self. From his earliest years, Otto's world was ceremony, a continuous performance in corridors of polished stone, surrounded by paintings of ancestors whose dead eyes seemed to judge him before he could even understand what it meant to displease them. Mornings began with prayers recited in Latin, afternoons with fencing practice or history lessons detailing the glorious reigns of men who had expanded borders and subdued revolts, and evenings with dinners where silver clinked against porcelain, and no one spoke above a murmur unless it was to quote scripture or imperial policy. He was groomed to be a mirror, reflecting the empire's imagined virtue, discipline, and divine right. And yet behind that reflection flickered something else, a restlessness, a hunger not for power, but for pleasure, not for rule, but for release, not for the cold legacy of bloodlines, but for the warmth of unshackled desire. Otto was not the first Habsburg to feel the iron grip of inherited purpose, but he may have been the first to reject it so completely without raising a sword or a manifesto. Instead, he chose softer weapons: wine, women, laughter too loud for marble halls, and pleasures too crude for family portraits. And from the moment he first broke formation, stepping out of line in some long-forgotten ceremony, refusing to recite his Latin, smirking when told of divine duty, it became clear that this prince would not be the empire's echo. And yet, the irony of his life would be this: that the more he rebelled, the more he remained bound. The further he strayed from the path set before him, the more violently the shadow of his family followed. Like a silent warden, always one step behind, always reminding him, through cold stares, withheld invitations, subtle exclusions, that there was no true escape from being born into a dying crown. Because Otto's tragedy was not that he was a bad man. It was that he was a man at all, trying to exist as a human in a system that only allowed symbols, trying to feel in a lineage that demanded stoicism, trying to breathe in a bloodline that had learned to hold its breath for centuries. The Empire did not want him to be happy. It wanted him to be useful, predictable, solemn, a walking cathedral of restraint. And when he refused to kneel before that altar, when he laughed too loudly in public, flirted too openly with servants, or left parties at dawn with women not of noble birth, it wasn't just scandal. It was sacrilege. But at the start, they forgave him. They called it youth. They called it eccentricity. They said, he'll grow out of it, and allowed him his indiscretions the way one might allow a caged animal to pace, as long as it didn't roar. Because for all his flaws, Otto still bore the face of a Habsburg, the jawline of an heir, the bearing of someone who might one day be called upon to uphold the dynasty. Not because he was meant to, but because the bloodline was thinning, and desperation, like rot, was setting in beneath the gold. And so they waited, hoping the wildness would pass, that the prince would find a wife, settle into some harmless post in the army or the court, and become another portrait in the long gallery of forgettable lords. But Otto had tasted freedom, not political, not philosophical, but sensual, reckless, bodily freedom. And like an addict of fresh air pulled from drowning, he would spend the rest of his life chasing that first gasp, even if it meant submerging himself deeper into the waters of self-destruction. This is not the story of a royal embarrassment. It is the story of a man who tried to drown the collapse of a 1,000-year empire in a wine glass, who tried to seduce forgetfulness in brothels, who tried to outrun his bloodline through every alleyway in Vienna, and who, in the end, learned that no matter how fast you flee, the past wears boots made for hunting. Otto of Austria was not born to be a monster. He was born to be an idea, and like all ideas forced onto the backs of real people, it crushed him. He was born into velvet and ceremony, but even the softest cage is still a cage. And from the moment little Otto took his first steps beneath the chandeliers of a palace that smelled faintly of polished wood, candle wax, and old ambition, he was already learning how to walk along the invisible lines of an empire that no longer knew whether it was rising or crumbling. The Habsburg world of the 1860s was a theater of survival, where tradition was clung to not because it inspired, but because it was the only thing left to believe in. The walls of the Hofburg Palace, lined with portraits of emperors who had once commanded popes, armies, and continents, now seemed less like a record of glory and more like a mausoleum of dwindling authority. And in that museum of vanishing power, young Otto, born to Archduke Karl Ludwig and Princess Maria Annunziata of Bourbon-II Sicilies, was raised not as a child, but as a continuation. He had tutors before he had friends, lessons in statecraft before stories, fencing matches before freedom. And from morning to night, his life was regimented into an imitation of greatness, an endless preparation for a future that would never arrive, a future that belonged to someone else, and yet demanded everything from him anyway. His father, Karl Ludwig, stood forever in the long shadow of his older brother, Franz Joseph, the aging emperor who had reigned since before Otto was born and would not die until Otto was already 40. Karl Ludwig, for all his loyalty, was always the second son. The man who might have been emperor had fate or assassins, not chosen otherwise. And perhaps it was that permanent position of almost power that made him raise Otto with such rigid, joyless intensity, as though greatness were not a gift, but a burden that could only be survived through discipline and denial. And so, Otto's days passed in silence. Or at least the kind of noise that sounds like silence. The clicking of boots on marble floors. The Latin recitations of tutors with cold eyes. The clatter of silver spoons in endless formal breakfasts where children were not allowed to speak unless spoken to. The ritualistic stiffness of morning prayers in candlelit chapels where the boys' eyes often wandered to the stained glass. Seeking escape in the saints, in the skies, in anything that wasn't the dull gold of imperial routine. Even his play was scripted. Toy soldiers were lined up in battalions. Miniature palaces stood in his nursery. He rode ponies not in fields, but in courtyard processions, under the gaze of guards who never smiled. He learned early that every movement had weight, that even laughter had to be measured, and that behind every open door stood someone ready to correct, discipline, or remind him who he was supposed to become. But no amount of etiquette lessons could extinguish the ember that flickered beneath his perfectly parted hair and polished boots. Because somewhere beneath the layers of brocade, medals, and expectation was a boy who did not want to rule, who did not even want to represent, but who simply wanted to live without being watched, to breathe without rehearsing, to grow without becoming a ghost of men he had never met. Vienna, in those years, was a city of mirrors, where every ball and ceremony reflected not joy, but anxiety, where the empire's splendor grew more frantic the closer it came to collapse. And Otto, sensitive to the rot beneath the pageantry, seemed to absorb that unease into his bones, even as a child, feeling perhaps too deeply that all this order was hollow, that the marble was cracking, that the men in uniform were speaking with borrowed confidence, and that the empire into which he was born was already beginning to rot from the inside. His cousins were falling, one by one, in scandal, in assassination, in despair. His uncle, Emperor Franz Joseph, grew more severe, more withdrawn, his long reign stretching like a shadow that refused to end, holding back younger generations from rising, from breathing, from changing. His elder cousin, Crown Prince Rudolf, the golden hope of the dynasty, took his own life in a hunting lodge when Otto was just 24. A murder-suicide pact that shocked the empire and left its succession shaken. And Otto, watching from the edge, learned then that even the brightest sons of empire could crumble under the weight of being someone else's future. And then, perhaps worst of all, there was Franz Ferdinand, the Archduke who dared to love whom he chose, who married below his rank, who walked openly with his wife, who believed that the dynasty could evolve, and who paid for that belief with 2 bullets in Sarajevo, a death that not only ended his life, but started a war that would drown the world. Otto, younger than both men, watched the empire hemorrhage its heirs not just to death, but to disobedience. And he understood, in a way the older men never did, that rebellion did not have to come with a pistol or a pamphlet. Sometimes it came with a smirk at the wrong time, a skipped ceremony, a lover in the wrong bed, a bottle drained behind closed doors, a silence too long during Mass. He was not born a revolutionary. He was born tired. Tired of the weight of crowns he would never wear. Tired of the ghosts he was expected to imitate. Tired of living in the middle of a funeral procession where no one was allowed to weep. He did not speak these things aloud, of course. The Habsburgs had long ago learned the value of quiet shame. But the revolt began anyway. In his eyes, in his posture, in his sudden refusals to attend Mass, in his early fascination with parties, with servants, with girls who laughed too loudly and didn't curtsy low enough. They said he was undisciplined. They said he was impulsive. They said he lacked gravitas. But what he truly lacked was belief. Belief that this house, this empire, this golden cage meant anything more than a beautiful lie meant to keep men like him quiet, dressed, and useful until they died. And so Otto began, slowly, quietly, to slip between the bars. First with jokes, then with lateness, then with drunkenness, then with women, then with scandal. Each act not just a rebellion, but a confession that he was no longer pretending. And if the empire was going to fall, he would not fall with it in silence. He would laugh. He would drink. He would make a spectacle of himself. Because sometimes, in a world that only allows you to perform, the only act of honesty left is to perform so wildly that they can no longer ignore what's broken. And what was broken in Otto was not his soul. It was the cage they built around it. The first time he was seen stumbling barefoot through the cobbled streets of Vienna, his shirt unbuttoned, a bottle in one hand, and a woman's perfume lingering on his skin, the city pretended not to notice. Not because it didn't care, but because it had always been taught to look away when Habsburgs bled in public. At first it was whispered, the sort of scandal that moved through the salons and cafes of the capital with a polite cough and a raised eyebrow, where gossip took the shape of smiles too wide, and wine glasses trembled just slightly more than usual when his name was spoken in proximity to words like duchess, dancer, or naked. But soon, the whispers became columns, delicate lines of ink in foreign papers, Parisian tabloids and Budapest journals, all eager to describe the fall of a man too handsome for his own good, too privileged to care, and too broken to hide it. They called him der schöne Otto, the beautiful Otto, not out of affection, but with the cruel reverence one might offer to a statue slowly crumbling from within. A reminder that even marble can rot if the poison comes from the blood, not the stone. And he was beautiful, in the tragic way that doomed men often are. Tall, with piercing eyes that seemed to carry more mischief than malice. A sharp smile made for both seduction and evasion, and the kind of effortless elegance that made it easy to forgive what should never have been forgiven. He didn't enter Vienna's nightlife like a visitor. He descended into it like a king returning to a throne that had always waited for him. Silk coats discarded in smoky dance halls, champagne poured like holy water in candlelit bordellos, carriages arriving at dawn with his boots thrown over the edge and a nameless companion giggling beneath his cloak. His world became one of mirrors and music, of masked balls where identities dissolved into scent and sweat, of clandestine lovers with royal titles and trembling hands, of rooms where laughter drowned out prayer, and where Otto, the prince of two empires, was finally allowed to feel something resembling freedom, even if it came at the cost of disgrace. There were nights when he danced until his legs gave out, collapsed into velvet chairs still laughing, bleeding from some invisible wound he couldn't name. Mornings when he woke in strange rooms, not knowing the name of the woman beside him, nor caring. Evenings when he rode through the Prater alone, his horse nearly trampling children, his eyes red, his coat stained with wine and perfume. And then, of course, there was the carriage incident. The story so vivid it became legend, retold with variations in every capital from London to Bucharest. Otto, found by police in the early hours of the morning, entirely nude, curled in the back of a royal carriage with a dancer from the Berg Theatre and 2 empty bottles of absinthe, shouting at the stars in French, accusing them of spying on him. The authorities said nothing. The newspapers were paid to look away. And the imperial household, well trained in the choreography of silence, simply removed his name from the guest list of the next state function. Because the truth was simple and inconvenient. Otto could not be punished. Not publicly, not harshly, not yet. Because in his veins flowed the same blood as the emperor himself. And punishing Otto would be admitting that the family was not immune to decay. And so the empire tolerated him the way a dying body tolerates a fever, knowing that it signals something is wrong, but too afraid to confront it directly. Behind closed doors, however, the discomfort was growing. Franz Joseph, a man so stoic that even grief seemed to bounce off his uniformed exterior, refused to speak Otto's name at dinner, while courtiers shifted nervously whenever he entered the room, afraid that proximity to scandal might be contagious. His siblings avoided him, his uncles ignored him. Invitations stopped arriving, and yet Otto, ever the performer, responded to exile by becoming even more visible, more indulgent, more spectacular, his life turning into a kind of opera in which he played the tragic tenor, doomed but defiant, mocked but magnificent, falling louder than any Habsburg had dared fall before. He became a symbol, not of nobility, but of its unraveling. A portrait of a prince in decline, framed by cigarette smoke and laughter too loud for the cathedral-like silence of the court. Women loved him and feared him. Men envied him and pitied him. Servants whispered about the things they saw in his chambers. Champagne spilled on prayer books, love letters written in lipstick on mirrors, bruises on his arms shaped like fingerprints, and eyes that no longer focused when addressed by name. It would have been easy, perhaps, to dismiss it all as hedonism. A spoiled man misusing his privilege, a bored aristocrat trying to escape boredom through debauchery. But beneath the layers of indulgence, there was something else. Something more desperate, more human, more tragic. Because Otto was not partying. He was unraveling. Each night spent in pleasure was a refusal to be his father, a refusal to uphold the rotting image of a dynasty that had crushed men like Rudolf and Franz Ferdinand, a refusal to wear a uniform that led nowhere but to war, a refusal to pretend that the empire was not dying, and that he was not dying with it. The scandal was not in his nakedness, but in his naked honesty. Because in a family that had perfected the art of hiding madness, sorrow, and sin behind marble masks, Otto did the unthinkable. He bled in the open. And Vienna, for all its refinement, could not look away. In a house where tradition was thicker than blood and silence more powerful than truth, punishment did not come as exile or imprisonment. It came as absence, as omission, as the slow peeling away of identity without so much as a raised voice or written decree. And for Archduke Otto, the empire's judgment arrived not with fury, but with the cold indifference of royalty protecting its own myth. No one dared say it aloud, certainly not in the Hofburg's candlelit corridors, nor under the domed ceilings of Schönbrunn, where ghosts of emperors still seemed to watch from portraits. But it was understood by all who mattered that Otto had become something too dangerous to handle and too embarrassing to acknowledge. A man too visible in his disgrace to be erased entirely, and yet too disobedient to be allowed near anything sacred. Franz Joseph, the emperor who had survived assassinations, revolutions, and the suicides of his own children, viewed scandal as a weakness worse than treason, not because it threatened power, but because it exposed the frailty of the dynasty's carefully curated image. And Otto, in his drunken wanderings and his unapologetic revelry, had pulled back the velvet curtain that the court had spent generations drawing tight. So the emperor did not confront Otto directly. He did not summon him, rebuke him, or offer the dignity of anger. He simply began to erase him from proximity, step by step, invitation by invitation, until Otto found himself no longer seated at banquets, no longer standing in parades, no longer summoned for strategy or ceremony, until his absence became louder than his presence had ever dared to be. At first it was subtle. A misprinted name in a program, a military honor delayed without explanation, a cousin's wedding he was never told about. But soon the erasures deepened, and Otto watched as the people around him turned their backs without needing to speak, their eyes refusing to meet his, their titles suddenly louder than their greetings, as if each "Your Imperial Highness" carried the unspoken end to a sentence. Who has dishonored us all. His position in the army, once decorative but dignified, was quietly diminished, reassigned, reduced, until he was left with a uniform and no function, a colonel in name only, too scandalous for battle and too volatile for diplomacy, a walking relic of a name that now flinched whenever it was linked to desire. And he felt it. He felt it in the stares of chamberlains who used to bow but now merely nodded. He felt it in the stiff silences of his brothers, who avoided speaking his name unless forced to. He felt it most in the eyes of his uncle Franz Ferdinand, the future heir, who had once shared Otto's hatred of ritual, but had learned, through calculation and compromise, how to bend without breaking. Something Otto, for all his defiance, had never managed to master. What Otto didn't realize, or perhaps realized too late, was that the imperial court didn't destroy its problems with confrontation. It buried them alive beneath layers of forgotten protocol. It wove them into the quiet places of the family's narrative where no biographer dared look. It silenced its own flesh, not with swords or shackles, but with the slow withdrawal of acknowledgement. The same way a body rejects a limb it no longer trusts. He was, in effect, excommunicated without exile. A prince still titled, still paid, still dressed, but with nowhere left to belong. And what makes such a fall unbearable is not the collapse itself, but the fact that it happens behind closed doors, in polite whispers and polite refusals. Until one day, you wake up and realize that the palace is no longer your home, but a stage on which your part has been rewritten, your lines removed, your presence edited out. They called him a delicate matter in internal memos. They referred to him in third person even when he stood in the same room. And when his name was brought up in discussions about the future of the dynasty, it was accompanied by sighs, long pauses, or subtle headshakes, as though the very idea of Otto, the very memory of his youth, was an infection the family hoped would never spread. He tried at first to win back their favor. He attended Mass with dull eyes, stood stiff at parades, offered to serve in minor diplomatic missions. But the offers were declined with civility, and the invitations never came again. And so, he stopped pretending. If he could not be redeemed, he would be remembered. If the court would not allow him to wear the face of a Habsburg, he would wear the mask of everything they feared most. He grew louder. He drank more. He left the Hofburg and moved into a private villa on the edge of the city, where the lights never dimmed and the servants were paid not to ask questions. And there, in rooms filled with music, incense, and the scent of bodies entangled in heat and forgetting, Otto built his kingdom of shame, his empire of one, ruled not by law or blood, but by appetite and oblivion. But it wasn't joy. It was defiance. Because behind the laughter was the sound of something breaking. A mirror, perhaps, or a man. And Vienna, for all its elegance, could smell the rot. Not on his clothes, which remained immaculate. Not in his voice, which still carried the lilt of nobility. But in the way his eyes no longer lingered on anything holy. In the way he passed by chapels without crossing himself. In the way he no longer looked up when church bells rang. In the way the housekeepers whispered of the women who wept in his corridors. He was still a prince. Still Otto. Still of the House of Habsburg. But now, he was the one name spoken behind fans, behind curtains, behind thick oak doors, always in a hush, always in a tone reserved for things too dangerous to speak of during dinner. The Empire had not disowned him. It had simply stopped believing he could be saved. And that, for a man who once stood in the light of 2 crowns, was a punishment far crueler than exile. It began with the laughter of women, sharp, sweet, echoing through velvet halls at midnight, and ended in a silence so thick that even the walls of his villa seemed ashamed to listen. But in the long descent between those 2 points, Archduke Otto of Austria crafted a life composed entirely of appetites, indulgences, and the illusion of warmth in a world that had turned its face away. He did not merely visit brothels, he built sanctuaries of forgetfulness in them. He did not simply take lovers, he drowned in them, chasing from one to the next with the desperation of a man trying to escape a burning house by walking deeper into the smoke. Because each pair of arms offered temporary amnesia, and each whispered lie of affection was better than the truth he already knew too well. That no woman, no wine, no pleasure could ever erase the taste of being rejected by his own blood. He kept mistresses in every city that would take him. Paris, Prague, Budapest, Vienna. A shadow empire stitched together not by treaties or titles, but by hotel keys, silk stockings, smudged rouge on collars, and the scent of jasmine or sweat lingering on bed sheets that were never meant to be shared by royalty. In these rooms, far from the marble of palaces and the judgment of court, Otto became something close to honest. Not noble, not wicked, but raw, broken, and hungry in ways no banquet could satisfy. He whispered to courtesans about ghosts, cried into necks he didn't know, called out names of women long gone, and sometimes, when the night was deep enough, he spoke to no one at all. There were rumors, always rumors, that some of the women bore his children, that there were boys in orphanages with the Habsburg jawline, and girls in boarding houses with the same haunted eyes. But no proof ever surfaced, and even if it had, what would it have changed? He was a man unraveling, not a man beginning. And those children, if they existed, were born not from love, but from the collision of despair and flesh. His spiral was not sudden. It was slow, like rot under polished wood, like mildew on ancient silk, like the way a candle doesn't die with a gust, but with the last quiver of flame before darkness swallows it whole. He began drinking at breakfast, first in defiance, then in habit. Then because he didn't know how to be sober anymore. He filled his lungs with smoke and his veins with anything that dulled the ache. Opium in Paris, laudanum in Vienna, morphine when he could bribe a physician. Friends stopped visiting, letters stopped arriving. Even the women who once cooed at his charm now avoided his door when the screaming began. Long, incoherent rants at God, at the Empire, at mirrors that refused to lie to him anymore. He was evicted from salons for drunkenness, thrown out of gentlemen's clubs for behavior that no longer amused, barred from opera boxes for being found unconscious in the arms of a chorus girl during the second act of Don Giovanni. But none of it stopped him, because at some point, Otto had stopped believing that there was anything left to recover. He wore fine clothes over a body growing thin and pale, bones pressing against silk like reminders of mortality. He hosted dinners where only empty chairs attended, pouring wine into crystal glasses for lovers who had long since left, toasting to toasts themselves, laughing at jokes no one made. He wrote poetry in lipstick on mirrors. He scrawled Latin verses in the margins of old military orders. He kept a diary, unpublished, unbound, illegible in parts, filled with phrases like, "The wine prays louder than the priest," and "The throne is not a seat, it is a shackle," and "My blood sings, but the song is in a dead language." The villa staff said he wandered the halls barefoot, speaking to portraits that weren't there, refusing food for days, then devouring an entire roast with his hands, crying in the bath for hours, then laughing when the water turned cold, and he realized he could still feel something. And yet there were glimpses, strange, tragic glimpses, of the man he might have been, of the beauty he once carried like a banner. A violinist passing by his window claimed to have seen Otto standing in the garden at dusk, dressed immaculately, holding a single white glove, staring at the horizon as if waiting for someone who would never arrive. A former mistress remembered a night when he recited Greek poetry under the stars with such tenderness that she wept, not for herself, but for him. A servant once claimed to find him kneeling before a crucifix, whispering, "I was never meant to carry the name," again and again, as if confessing to a God who had stopped listening. But none of it saved him, because redemption requires belief, and Otto, for all his decadence, had long stopped believing in salvation, in family, in the empire, in himself. He was a man who had turned pleasure into armor, indulgence into identity, vice into religion. And like all religions built on escape, it demanded more than it gave. By the time the new century approached, Otto had become a relic of a world collapsing in slow motion, a walking obituary for the aristocracy, a living warning that even the most glorious names cannot protect a man from drowning in his own longing. He was not hated. He was pitied. And perhaps that, more than anything, was the final insult. Because Otto had once been feared, adored, envied, now he was simply avoided. No longer a prince, just a man with a beautiful face and shaking hands, drifting from bed to bottle to bed again, trying to forget the one thing he could never escape: that he had been born into power, but not into peace. And that no empire, no matter how gilded, can heal the wounds it refuses to name. The Great War did not arrive like a storm. It arrived like a crack in a marble floor, hair thin at first, barely noticed by those who danced above it. But slowly, steadily, it spread beneath the feet of kings and commoners alike, until the ground gave way and the empire Otto had been born to represent collapsed into the dust of its own illusions. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo in 1914, the gunshots that echoed in that Balkan street did not just end the life of a man. They shattered the already crumbling architecture of a world Otto could no longer understand. And though he had not been close to his cousin in blood or temperament, Otto must have felt, in some ancient part of his chest, that the death marked not only a personal tragedy, but the first tolling bell for a dynasty too old to evolve and too proud to step aside. As Austria-Hungary descended into war, the court mobilized with theatrical urgency. Generals posed for photographs. Ministers issued proclamations with trembling signatures. And noblemen donned freshly tailored uniforms, stitched with medals awarded in anticipation rather than action. But Otto, once considered a potential military figure, found himself conspicuously absent from the center of things, uninvited to the councils of war, uninvolved in decisions that would define the empire's fate. Too scandalous to trust, too unpredictable to include, too broken to redeem. The empire that had once tolerated his excesses now treated him like a relic of pre-war shame, a symbol of decadence in an age that suddenly demanded sacrifice, order, and moral rigidity. And as the front lines moved and bodies piled and nations burned, Otto drifted further into irrelevance, watching the fall of everything he was supposed to represent from the shadows of his own disgrace. He was still technically an archduke, still addressed with formality by servants and diplomats who avoided eye contact, still received allowances that dwindled with the empire's coffers. But whatever illusion of importance he had clung to was gone now. And in its place stood a man whose bloodline meant nothing to soldiers dying in trenches, nothing to peasants starving in winter, nothing to the new century rising with the quiet rage of the disillusioned. His younger brother, Karl, suddenly and unexpectedly became heir after Franz Ferdinand's death, and then, in 1916, ascended as Emperor Karl I upon the death of Franz Joseph. An emperor born not out of legacy, but necessity, tasked with salvaging a crumbling state in the middle of an unwinnable war. And Otto, who had once laughed at ceremony and sneered at obligation, now stood in the strange position of being the older brother to a crowned man, a displaced relic watching history unfold without him. There are no records of Otto offering counsel to Karl. No letters of advice, no appearances at court, no rallies of support. Perhaps because by then, Otto understood that he had nothing left to offer, no loyalty that could be trusted, no influence that could be wielded, no reputation that could survive daylight. Or perhaps he simply didn't care anymore. Because when the empire began to die, Otto didn't rise to defend it. He simply sank with it, not in glory, not in defiance, but in slow, self-inflicted oblivion. His face, once the subject of gossip columns and bedroom sketches, grew hollow. His frame, once clothed in tailored uniforms and perfumed coats, became gaunt, wrapped in ill-fitting layers that smelled of neglect and sweat. His voice, once playful and defiant, became muttered, slurred, or silent, depending on the hour of day and the depth of the bottle. He was seen wandering the city parks in tattered gloves, feeding birds with shaking hands, speaking to himself in a mix of German, French, and something less coherent. His words not declarations, but memories escaping. Children were warned not to go near him. Veterans looked away when he passed. Women who once had chased his shadow now crossed the street. And the newspapers, once fascinated by his scandals, now ignored him entirely, because in wartime, shame no longer sells. And Otto had long since ceased to be amusing. The end of the empire was not sudden. It was pathetic. Austria-Hungary didn't fall with an explosion, but with a sigh, a whimper, a quiet scattering of ministries and generals and palaces, as new nations rose from its corpse like vultures pretending to be doves. When Karl abdicated in 1918, the Habsburg monarchy was officially dead, though its ghosts would linger for decades, and its sins for centuries. But Otto, who had never worn the crown, did not need a revolution to end his reign. He had overthrown himself long before history could. By the time the empire was gone, Otto was already a ghost. Not because he died, but because the world he had belonged to no longer existed. No one cared that he was the grandson of Franz Joseph. No one cared that he had danced with duchesses, or drunk with princes, or whispered poetry to actresses under candelabra. No one cared what his name had once meant. And Otto, stripped of pageantry, ceremony, and inheritance, found himself in the rarest position for a royal. Alone not by accident, but by design. Forgotten not because of injustice, but because he had become exactly what the empire had trained him never to be: human. And humans, when they fall, are not rescued. They are stepped over. He spent his final years not in exile, but in absence, not in punishment, but in erasure, not in betrayal, but in the kind of bitter obscurity that only aristocracy can inflict on its own. A silent condemnation written in empty seats, unopened letters, and wine glasses that never ran dry because they were never poured by friends. Otto did not rage against the fall of the empire. He drank to it, one glass at a time, until his hands stopped shaking, and even the mirrors gave up reflecting him. When the war ended, and the map of Europe was redrawn by men who had never bowed before a crown, the name Habsburg became less a title and more a warning, a relic of failed ambitions and buried monarchies. And in that new world, where emperors were reduced to footnotes and palaces to tourist attractions, Archduke Otto of Austria found himself not as a fallen prince, nor even as a man of history, but as a kind of walking remainder. The ghost of a dynasty too proud to adapt and too slow to realize it was no longer needed. There was no trial, no decree of exile for Otto. Unlike his brother Karl, who was formally stripped of power and shipped to Madeira like a dethroned chess piece, Otto was not worth the paperwork. It was not that the world rejected him, but that it simply forgot he existed. And in that forgetting, his punishment became total. Not execution, not imprisonment, not even humiliation, but that cruelest form of oblivion, the kind in which one is allowed to live long enough to watch one's name grow cold in the mouths of others. He left Vienna with little ceremony, a single suitcase, and no farewell. Not because no one dared stop him, but because no one thought to. And when he boarded the train that would take him away from the city of his youth, there was no crowd, no tears, no reporters, only the distant sound of bells tolling for another funeral, one he was not invited to, and perhaps had never truly left. In the years that followed, Otto wandered, not like a prince displaced, but like a man whose home had never really existed in the first place. He moved from manor to manor, countryside to countryside, sometimes in Austria, sometimes in Germany, sometimes in lands that no longer bore the names they had when he was born. Taking shelter in the estates of distant relatives who offered hospitality more from obligation than affection. Their voices always a little too polite, their dinners always a little too quiet, their glances always shifting when he drank too quickly or laughed too loud. He tried to write. Letters, journals, reflections, scrawled in ink that bled across the page, sometimes crossing into the margins, sometimes slipping into French or Latin, as though even language could not stay loyal to him. He wrote to women who no longer answered, to brothers who no longer replied, to an empire that no longer existed. He asked for nothing and received less. In the villages where he wandered, no one recognized him, not because his face had changed, but because time had made it irrelevant. He was still beautiful, in that distant, aching way that only fading stars are. But beauty without context is just another face in the crowd. And so Otto passed through towns and churches and cafes like a man made of mist, sitting quietly at tables, ordering brandy with shaking hands, listening to conversations that never included him. His health declined, as it always must in such lives, not with drama, but with the slow, inevitable surrender of the body to the mind's despair. He began to sleep during the day and pace at night, mumbling to portraits that hung only in memory. Servants, when he could afford them, said he spoke often to empty chairs, offering toasts in broken German, sometimes laughing, sometimes crying, sometimes both. He talked of a woman named Eugenia, then of a Maria, then of a dancer in Paris whose name he never finished. He spoke of horses he once owned, of soldiers who never listened, of a crown he had never worn, and of a throne he had never wanted. He did not curse his brother Karl. He spoke of him gently, wistfully, as though Karl had ascended to something greater than kingship, something Otto had never touched. Dignity. But he resented the silence, not the world's silence. The families. No invitations came for birthdays or funerals or christenings. No one asked how he was or where. He became a ghost in their narrative, a blank space in the family tree, an anecdote to be avoided, a reminder that even the most powerful blood can clot, curdle, and vanish when left unattended. They removed his portrait from public galleries. They left his name out of memoirs. Otto von Habsburg, the future European Parliament member and architect of a modern post-war dynasty, never once mentioned his uncle in print. To preserve the family's honor, they buried Otto alive in silence. And he knew it. He wrote it. In one of his final surviving letters, unsigned, unaddressed, dated only autumn, he scribbled, "They've stolen even my memory. They've turned my laughter into shame and my grief into scandal. If I had died at 25, they might have wept. If I had fought in war, they might have forgiven. But I lived, and in living, I proved them mortal." Toward the end, he lived in a small house outside a small town, surrounded by hedges and silence, where the wallpaper peeled like old skin and the windows faced a garden that never bloomed. He had a dog once, named Kaiser, but it ran away. A housekeeper came twice a week, left meals he rarely touched. Neighbors said they heard piano music late at night, even though no piano was ever seen delivered. One child claimed to see him walking barefoot in the snow, shirtless, talking to the moon. And when asked, years later, what they remembered most about the man in the garden, the answer was always the same. He looked like someone who had been important once, but forgot why. By the year 1906, when his body finally surrendered to the weight of years soaked in wine, forgotten by titles and emptied of affection, Otto of Austria had long since ceased to be a man of flesh and will. He had become something softer, thinner, more spectral, a figure half remembered even while alive, a whisper of disgrace attached to a name once carved in marble, but now reduced to dust, swept under the rugs of Europe's new republics. His death did not come swiftly, and it did not come with dignity. It came like everything else in Otto's life after the fall. Slowly, invisibly, uncelebrated. A creeping erosion rather than a collapse. A daily loss of appetite, a growing silence in his chest where laughter used to echo. A trembling in his hands that made the glass harder to lift, the pen harder to hold, the prayer harder to finish. He no longer walked. He no longer wrote. He barely spoke. There were days he sat for hours beside an open window, eyes unfocused, watching the wind-stirred trees he could no longer name. And when asked, by the rare physician, the occasional housemaid, the passing clergyman, how he felt, he would only murmur vague things about dreams where water rose too high, or rooms filled with smoke, or mothers who never turned to face him. The official report, when it came, stated plainly, death from renal failure and advanced infection, complicated by years of alcohol abuse. But those who saw him in his final weeks, if anyone truly saw him at all, knew that Otto did not die from illness. He died from accumulation. From the slow drowning in a life whose waves had long stopped crashing, whose tide had turned to sludge, whose horizon no longer promised rescue. He died from exile, from being cut off not only from power, but from memory, from purpose, from connection. He died from silence, from the letters that were never answered, the birthdays never acknowledged, the invitations never extended. He died from names once whispered in candlelight, now unspoken even in dreams. He died from the mirrors that no longer lied to him, from the absence of forgiveness, from the weight of living too long in a world where everyone who had once remembered him had either died or chosen to forget. There was no great final scene, no last words recorded for posterity, no noble farewell whispered with a trembling hand to a faithful servant. He passed in sleep, or something like sleep, on a spring night where no candles were lit, no family was gathered, no priest was summoned. His breath slowed, then ceased. And that was all. No royal funeral followed. No carriages draped in black moved through the streets of Vienna. No public mourning was declared. No requiem mass was held in the imperial chapel beneath the frescoed ceiling where his ancestors had once crowned themselves with eternity. His body was taken by cart, unmarked, to a modest cemetery outside the city where the soil was hard and the tombstones were plain. And the priest who performed the burial did not know the name of the man whose grave he blessed. There was no marble cross, no bronze plaque, only a small wooden marker with a misspelled name. By the time the marker rotted, even that too was gone. And so, the man who had once been the handsomest prince in the empire, the one they called Der schöne Otto, the golden child of two dynasties, the heir not quite apparent, the scandal whispered in every corner of Europe's drawing rooms, the disgrace buried by bloodline and bureaucracy alike, disappeared without ceremony. And it was not just his life that was buried. It was the possibility of remembrance. Because in the weeks following his death, the imperial household acted quickly, not out of grief, but out of instinct. The same instinct that had driven them to silence his name while he was alive, to erase, to redact, to pretend that the decay had never touched the crown. Portraits of Otto were quietly removed from the Hofburg archives. Mentions of him were excised from internal family records. Historians tasked with writing official accounts of the Habsburg lineage were instructed to focus on continuity, not controversy, which was code, of course, for omission. And the younger generations, those born too late to know his face, too protected to hear the stories, grew up in a version of history where Otto had never quite existed, or at most was an unfortunate cousin, a troubled relative, a minor figure best left undiscussed. Even Otto von Habsburg, the new hope of the family name, the man who would later claim the moral mantle of his ancestors in the European Parliament, never once publicly acknowledged his uncle. Not in speeches, not in memoirs, not in interviews. To have been erased by enemies is one thing. To be erased by your own blood is something else entirely. And yet perhaps Otto would not have minded. Perhaps in those final years, he had made peace with the forgetting. Perhaps the burial, the anonymity, the silence. Perhaps all of it felt like a final kindness. After all, he had tried to flee his name all his life. He had tried to drown it in champagne, to scatter it in the arms of strangers, to hide it beneath lace and smoke and theater curtains, to break it in public, like a man smashes a cursed heirloom. And so when that name was finally taken from him, when even the dynasty that had made him now pretended he had never been, it was not tragedy. It was completion. A man born into gold, who had spent his life clawing at tarnish, had finally been allowed to disappear. No applause, no grief, no scandal, only silence. And in that silence, perhaps, at last, Otto could rest. History, as it is often written by those who survive with clean hands, has never been about remembering. It has always been about arranging, about selecting which names to enshrine in marble and which to allow to sink into the cold mud of time. And in the case of Archduke Otto of Austria, no formal decree was needed to consign him to oblivion, because the silence itself became the sentence. And in that silence, 1,000 lies could be told more effectively than one truth ever could. They did not call him disgraced. They simply called him nothing. And in that not calling, in that refusal to speak, to print, to acknowledge, the damage was complete. Because no scandal burns forever, but shame buried deeply enough becomes a kind of fossil. And Otto, once the living embodiment of a dynasty's fracture, was allowed to decay not just in flesh, but in memory, until he became less a man and more a cautionary tale, too shameful for footnotes. When the empire fell, its documents were scattered like dead leaves. Some burned in panic, others sold to collectors, still others catalogued in great leather-bound volumes by archivists who wore gloves as if the truth might stain them. And somewhere, among these fragments, Otto's name still appeared. On birth records, on military rosters, in the margins of forgotten correspondences from a court that no longer stood. But these fragments were just that, pieces. There was no full story, no biography, no legacy to defend, no voice left to protest. Because what had once been a living body, a man full of contradictions, longing, vice, and pain, had been broken down by the curators of dynastic memory into a single, manageable narrative, unworthy. And unworthy men, no matter how noble their birth, are allowed to vanish. His portraits, once hung in modest corners of the Hofburg, were either removed or quietly misattributed. The Vienna archives, when questioned decades later, claimed they had no significant materials on Otto Karl Victor von Habsburg, despite official records proving he had once held a military title, once lived within those very walls. Family albums, passed down to later generations, often featured photographs with names carefully penned below. Franz Joseph, Karl, Zita, Maximilian. But when Otto appeared, the space beneath his image was left blank, as though even ink had learned to avert its eyes. In conversations among surviving members of the Habsburg line, his name was avoided not with malice, but with a kind of trained grace, like one learns to avoid discussing illness at dinner or poverty at weddings. He had become their internal scar, and like all old wounds, it was easier to pretend it had healed than to examine how deep it had gone. Even Otto von Habsburg, the great-nephew who would rise to political prominence in post-war Europe, a man whose speeches carried the weight of history and whose words helped stitch together a new, modern vision of continental unity. Even he, who bore the same name, who stood on the ruins of the very empire Otto had watched unravel. Even he never once publicly mentioned the uncle who had died alone. Not in memoir, not in tribute, not in warning. Because in the modern world, the Habsburgs now occupied a world of diplomacy, of European cooperation, of quiet Catholic virtue. There was no space left for a man like Otto. He was too raw, too real, too damaged to fit within the polished narrative of a noble family that had rebranded itself as civilized victims of war, rather than proud architects of a dying monarchy's self-destruction. To mention him would be to reopen the door to everything they had shut out: indulgence, decay, madness, loss, shame. To remember him would be to admit that even those born into gold can rot from within. And so, year after year, decade after decade, he faded. Not violently, but cleanly, as if he had never been. Occasionally, a curious historian would stumble upon a line in a document. A party attended, a military transfer requested, a fine issued for public indecency, and follow the thread to its frayed and disappearing end. But there was never enough to write the full story. never enough to say anything definitive. And in academia, where citation is currency, the silence became a wall. Otto was not denied history. He was denied context. And a man without context becomes myth, or worse, footnote. Once in the 1980s, a minor exhibition of the Habsburg court was held in Vienna, featuring uniforms, tapestries, letters, and portraits. One photograph showed a group of young archdukes in uniform, standing beside a carriage. A woman pointed to the man second from the left, slouched, smiling crookedly, and asked the curator, "Who is that one?" The curator paused, then replied, "We're not sure." And the woman moved on, just like that. And that is how Otto died a second death, not of the body, but of the name. Because to be remembered incorrectly is a tragedy. But to be forgotten so effectively that even your face becomes anonymous, that is a cruelty reserved not for monsters, but for embarrassments. And Otto was not a monster. He did not start wars. He did not destroy lives. He did not betray countries. His crime was simpler and perhaps more unforgivable in the eyes of legacy. He failed to become what others demanded of him. He failed to wear the mask. He failed to pretend that marble blood did not run cold when left unacknowledged. And in that failure, he became more honest than any Habsburg had dared to be in generations. Too human, too visible, too broken to be allowed a grave with his name. Perhaps the saddest thing about Otto of Austria is not how he lived or how he died, but how he was never truly allowed to begin. How from the moment he entered the world, wrapped in crests and titles, embroidered with expectations and baptized in the name of two empires, he was handed a script written generations before and told not just to read it, but to become it, even if the lines suffocated him, even if the story was already ending before he stepped onto the stage. He was born into legacy, but not into purpose, into royalty, but not into freedom, into gold, but not into grace. And what followed for the next 40 years was not the fall of a villain or the ruin of a rebel, but the slow, painful unraveling of a man who was handed everything except the space to be himself. What do we do with a prince who does not become a king? What do we do with a man whose bloodline promised destiny, but whose heart refused obedience? History has little use for such people. It knows what to do with heroes. It knows what to do with tyrants. But with the broken, the miscast, the inconvenient, it lets them drift into fog. Otto did not try to rule. He did not try to reform. He did not try to reclaim anything. He simply tried to forget, day by day, drink by drink, mistake by mistake. And in that forgetting, he became everything his family feared: visible, vulnerable, unguarded. He was a prince who laughed too loudly, who kissed too freely, who wept when no one was looking, who refused to bow when the ceremony meant nothing, who looked at the empire and saw not glory, but a cage dressed in velvet. And for that, he was erased. Because monarchies do not know how to forgive the human. They only know how to preserve the myth. Otto tore holes in that myth, not with speeches or revolts, but with wine-stained mornings and nights spent with dancers, with public embarrassment and private collapse, with a life that refused to conform to marble ideals. He did not fail because he was weak. He failed because he was real. And the world he was born into did not allow reality. It demanded obedience, performance, perfection. Anything less was deviance, and deviance was disgrace. so they buried him, first with silence, then with time. But perhaps there is something to learn in that silence. Perhaps Otto's life, in all its waste and sorrow and mess, reveals something the clean stories cannot, that to be royal is not to be strong or wise or powerful. It is to carry the weight of 1,000 invisible expectations, and to be crushed by the contradiction of being watched and never truly seen. Because Otto was not loved for who he was. He was loved for who he was supposed to be. And when he failed to meet that standard, the love disappeared. And when the love disappeared, so did he. But still there is something tender in the image of him in his final days. The forgotten prince in a forgotten garden, writing poetry in the margins of unpaid bills, raising a glass to memories that never spoke back, tracing names on frosted windows, not to remember, but to prove he once knew them. Still, there is something tragic and beautiful in the idea of a man who tried to drink the empire out of his bloodstream. Still, there is something human in the way he called out in his sleep, not for power, but for forgiveness. And maybe, just maybe, that is why his story matters. Not because it ends in glory, not because it warns or teaches, but because it reminds us that beneath every crown is a skull, and beneath that, a heart. And sometimes, the heart breaks, even in gold, especially in gold. So let us speak his name now, softly, after all these years. Otto Karl Victor von Habsburg, a prince, a scandal, a ghost, a man. And may we remember not just how he fell, but why. Because no one taught him how to stand without a crown, and because some men, when told they must represent a dying world, choose instead to drown with it, in laughter, in longing, in silence, in vice, and in a kind of freedom that looks, from the outside, like ruin, but which may have been, in his heart, the only act of rebellion left to him. He was a prince who tried to escape the empire not by fleeing its borders, but by fleeing its script. And for that, for his failure, his nakedness, his defiance, we owe him this. Not pity, not praise, but memory. Because even the forgotten deserve to be seen, and even the disgraced deserve to be mourned, not for what they became, but for who they were before history looked away. History remembers emperors, not the ones who collapsed beneath the weight of their crowns. Otto never ruled, but he showed us what happens when a man is denied the right to be one. And sometimes, that truth is worth more than a title. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel. There are more forgotten voices still waiting to be heard.